Water and wastewater systems can no longer remain silent utilities. There's PFAS in drinking water, there's PFAS in biosolids, the lead and copper rule, you got your regular operations, you got main breaks every once in a while, some boil water advisories occasionally. There's a lot to communicate to the public. And more than ever before, the public is demanding more transparency and deeper communication about their water. So, where in the world do you start? I'm Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest. I am here today with Mike McGill. He is the president of WaterPIO. He handles communications for water utilities all across the country on many different subjects. Mike, thank you so much for being here today and talking to us about this subject.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, why don't we start a little bit about understanding these priorities in terms of the communication lens? We've talked about these priorities with some other guests over the past couple of weeks in other angles, but from a communication standpoint, it's almost seems more important than ever to be really communicative about these particular issues.
Yeah, it right now what we're telling people is just get everything ready to go. Get started because we've got two major challenges ahead of us. You have the lead and copper rule, you have the PFAS, everything going on with PFAS that's going to crop up in the next year or two. And meanwhile, you've got to do your overall communications because you don't want to fail on the back end with just regularly communicating with your customers about the infrastructure that you're going to be building, hopefully with infrastructure money. If you have any rate increases that you have for major projects, you don't want to have to, kind of catch up with what you do every day because you're putting so much emphasis on the lead and copper rule and the PFAS provisions that we're going to have to deal with.
Hmm. Yeah, it feels more than ever that there are more competing priorities than ever for water utilities. I feel like usually we're dealing with one, maybe two particular issues in a given year, and this year it feels like there's five or six, and they're just
Right.
multivariate and complex. How are utilities trying to handle that type of complexity, especially in terms of communicating it to their, their public, their ratepayers?
We used to see it, there used to be a seasonal emphasis. My first job in water, I was a spokesperson for a utility that had 2,000 water main breaks in a year. So during the wintertime, it was all about aging infrastructure. And during the summertime, of course, then we dealt with, the consent decree we had on the wastewater side and wastewater spills that always used to crop up. Now it's just a consistent pressure, if you will, on what a water utility does and what it has to communicate about. We were all waiting and waiting and waiting for the lead and copper rule to come, and then it came down, and then you had another delay, and then you had people waiting for the guidance. We're not going to get started working on communications until we get the guidance on the lead and copper rule. Then, while all that was going on, you had PFAS developments hitting hard, and the in June with the health advisories for PFOA and PFOS, kind of the way I put it is the two worst PFAS chemicals. When
Hmm.
that came down, and the EPA basically said it doesn't matter if you have an undetect, you could be accused of having them in your water. Well, that shook the ground a lot. We've been called in several states where regulators are having kind of panicked reactions to it. And that's put pressure on various utilities. Do we have to start testing at parts per quadrillion levels? Yeah, which no, you don't. But and the EP and the assistant administrator for water said you didn't have to when pressed on questions from reporters. There's just a wild west going on right now, and as we turn a corner, we turn into emphasis on fulfilling the lead and copper rule. We have UCMR 5 where we're testing for 29 PFAS starting next year. You've got those two big hammers, if you will, coming down on public confidence in drinking water. At the same time, we've got to talk about what we do and how we do it every day. Um, Jackson, Mississippi, making news right now. It's a rare circumstance there that the infrastructure would fail to that degree.
Hmm.
Would be allowed to fail to that degree, to be honest with you. But it is a question we should get out front and answer. What are we doing on our with our infrastructure to make sure that a Jackson doesn't happen? So there are all those issues that will crop up, and we have to get out front and talk about them. The benefit is the customer is going to feel served. They're going to be, They want to be reassured that everything's going to be okay. And if you're out front talking about these issues first, you're going to be in a better position to succeed with them.
Yeah, there is this increasing emphasis, I believe, in the current era of communications on transparency and
Right.
being much more forthright than most utilities ever would have been in the past. And I think this extends even into the business world too, where
Yeah.
there's a lot more transparency now than ever before. Um, is that something that you consider to be kind of like one of the big challenges with the water industry in particular, or what? And if not, what are some of those bigger challenges?
Well, no, I agree. I often say this to people. The water world is about 10 years behind when it comes to being out there and being transparent with their customers,
Hmm.
with the people they serve. I came over from news in 2007. First role was with the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, serving 2 million people, but it was in DC where I had worked in journalism. So my team and we brought in a journalistic point of view to it, a look at it. Uh, that was rare because honestly, out of sight, out of mind had worked for many utilities before. Because if we just did our jobs, did them well, and the public didn't know about us, we were a quiet company, then everything would be fine. The problem was when we had needs and we had to go to the customer would say, "What are you talking about? You haven't talked to us about this before. What do you mean you're dropping this hammer on us now with rate increases and plan upgrades?"
Hmm.
Um, so we still deal with that in some cases. We'll have clients that we are in conversations with for a long period of time, and when it gets to that final moment of passage of bringing on a communications team, people will pull back in out of concern that they don't want to step out and make themselves a target. The fact is, the world we live in, and this is what I talk about, we live in the instant information age. Your
Hmm.
customers are getting the information they want without having to ask for it. I'm getting pinged right now during this interview. So utilities that act like that world isn't happening out there are really setting themselves up for failure. I could say they're playing Russian roulette with their reputations, because if they don't get out front, the customer can go elsewhere now for information.
Hmm.
That phone, that computer, social media, they can find whatever they want. And usually it's not correct. And usually it's going to show the utility in a bad light. So
Hmm.
if you're not getting out there and getting out front, especially with the challenges we have ahead, you're really putting yourself in a position to fail.
Yeah. Would you prefer to have control over your message, or would you prefer the neighborhood group on Facebook to control that message
That's
for
right.
you?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And if you're part of that neighborhood group, or your employees are part of that neighborhood group, which is what we always tell people is, your employees are your representatives out there in the
Hmm.
community. You know, they feel served. They've got someone direct that they can talk to,
Hmm.
all the time, or ask questions of. And if you're there and part of the conversation, they'll appreciate you for it. I've been, crisis comms is a specialty of mine coming out of news. I've dealt with social media during crisis situations, which is not fun because bombs will be dropped on you. But if you are there explaining the information from the utility perspective, because you do know more than the person screaming at you on Facebook, the public, they just want to be reassured. They'll appreciate you for it.
Hmm.
90 to 95% of people online are looking in on conversations, and they just want information. If you're there providing it and someone continues to yell and scream at you, well, they'll turn on the person yelling and screaming at you because they're getting in the way of information they need to get through their day. And so we have to respect that. The utilities that get into trouble now are the ones that are saying, "Oh, look at that. They're screaming and yelling at me. There's like a dozen people calling me evil things online. I'm staying away from that. I'm not taking part in that." And what that does mean is what you just talked about. You let those people control your message.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about a couple of different things here that if you've been listening, you've found a couple of different tips, I guess, for some communications here. But what are some of the foundational tips that you often provide to utilities and say, hey, here's kind of like the way to get started with at least lay the groundwork for everything. Obviously, there's so much more beyond just that, but what are some of those foundational tips that you often try and communicate to utilities?
So this comes in my first roles in water. I basically did reputation rehabs. The
Hmm.
utilities I was brought on with before I started Water PIO, when I was just working with my personal employers, we I was brought on board to rehab their reputation. So the way you do that is you get everybody together and you have hard conversations. I'm a big believer in SWOT analysis. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you get people in the room, and they have to be honest for it to work. And you have to stress that this is the time where you get to lay everything out so that we improve for the future. You
Hmm.
get that all together, and you start developing your roadmap of, okay, here are strengths that we can emphasize. Here are weaknesses that we can attack. Here's the threats that could blow everything to pieces. And here are opportunities that if we just go forward with some proactive communications, we can improve our standing. And you go forward from there, and then you start, putting together the proactive plan. Like I talked about the seasonal work, during the fall, we would talk about schools and kids and water and fog messaging around the holidays. Then during the winter, prep for winter, water main breaks, all the winter impacts, showing the hard work of employees at 4 o'clock in the morning in a 10-degree hole, getting them back in water. It works. And so you start plugging away at it. I'm also a big believer in working with the press as a former news producer. And this is an area where water utilities fail now because it's so easy to just put things out on social media.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily have to call up a reporter anymore to get the word out to your customers. But I stress this a lot. I know what newsrooms are like. They're understaffed. They don't have time. They're juggling 6 stories a day. When I was a planning editor 20 years ago, I had to juggle two dozen stories a day. The dozen going on that day and the dozen going on the next day. So if if you come to me in a newsroom with information that covers the majority of my viewers or readers and what they use every day, a basic essential resource, and you've got information for me that connects, that I can use and put on the air, I'm going to thank you for it. The coverage is going to get better. Even if they don't use it, you've kind of built up the relationship so that maybe they'll turn to you. Hey, what do you got for me? Hey, it's cold outside. What do you want to do a winter weather story? Things like that. You're slowly building up, through proactive communications, relationships with the press, with the customer. You're just getting, and elected officials, community leaders as well. You bring them in and you kind of go forward with the message. It's a force multiplier, if you will.
Hmm.
And a lot of utilities are concerned about, oh, that sounds like a ton of work. Actually, it isn't. If you do it right, you plan it out properly, and you have everything packaged and ready to go, it doesn't take as much time as you might think.
Yeah, it could be literally a 15-minute phone call. I've been the reporter calling that person, and you're totally right. If they come to me first, the next time I have to talk about water, that's the first person I'm going to. Oh,
That's
I know
right.
someone at the water plant. Like, of course I'm going to go to them. I think you're totally right with that. It lends itself more to that, again, that transparency, like putting yourself forward. You kind of have to step in front of the plant a little bit here
That's
to
right.
communicate
That's right.
appropriately now. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much for being here, taking the time with me. I appreciate all the time that you've given me. For everyone who's watching, check out our description below. We'll have some links to some resources, including some things from Mike down there that you can check out. And once more to you, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. See you on the road.